autumnal day, enjoy it. This is our centenary, the Faculty of Education centenary. It's 100 years since education was first taught in UWA. We're having a year of celebration. One of the highlights of our celebration is this inaugural address by Professor Steve Zubrick. It's a great honour for me to introduce Steve to you today, although I suspect that many of you are actually groupies and know him from a long time back. We're thrilled to bits to have him as a staff member in the Faculty of Education. From this year, Steve and his colleagues David Lawrence and Kate Taylor are half-time members of staff in our faculty. What an honour that is. And so it's appropriate that we have this team in our faculty, not only because the great honour that they bring with them, but also because in our faculty we have now started a Master of Teaching in Early Childhood and Care. And we are preparing teachers for 0 to 8 in that program to complement the preparation of teachers for primary and, of course, our old standby, the secondary teacher preparation program, of which I am a graduate. So it's been around a very long time. And there are probably many of you in this room who have known of that program. But it's Steve and his team add great richness to this program. Let me just tell you a couple of things about Steve, for those that you don't know. His background is not in education, but in speech pathology and audiology. And he has qualifications in clinical psychology and neuropsychology. But in his interest today, he's been focusing on the early years of children's development. And that's what we're mostly here today to talk about and to learn about. So I want you to join me, please, in a very warm welcome to Steve, who will be talking to you for about 50 minutes, and we'll have time for questions after that. So please, welcome Steve.
Well then, let's just check to see this is, it's working, yes? Yeah, good. Otherwise I'll use my other voice. Thank you, Helen. Let me acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and their elders past and present, and get this charged up here to get us going today. I also, in thinking about stepping into talking with you today, I must say I feel 30 years younger just looking around the audience here. It's like coming home. I had a bit of a reflection on the opportunity and thought really I couldn't help but reflect on my thoughts when Helen asked if I would speak in the centenary year of the faculty. And that's because education has a real meaning for me. My paternal grandparents were illiterate, and they were refugees from war-torn Russia and Eastern Europe, and in the space of 2 generations, education has transformed my parents and me. So I step into an opportunity to talk in the faculty about something that is very near and dear to my heart, and to a group of people and a profession that transforms who we are. And I think it's that spirit that I relate to the opportunity today. I have other acknowledgments I should note here. They include Kate Taylor, Mabel Rice, and Daniel Christensen, David Lawrence and Francis Mitru, and the entire LAL team. I think you're here. from that standpoint. Helen, of course, my gratitude for the opportunity today. Robin Owens at the Vice Chancellery has had a role in our team being here, not just in this centenary year, but in prior years. And Xiao and Naomi have been the people that have enabled us to come together today. So thank you all. My talk takes as its springboard a belief about children and what I'm observing in today's world. And it's always hazardous to start a title of a talk with a negative. But I've chosen this for a very particular reason. Children are not rockets, and what we're going to be doing is talking about that generally from the standpoint of their language development and trying to bring to that an observation about our expectations about preschool and early primary school development and opportunities. It's something I know you all have in common with this interest. In setting the scene, it's critical that we acknowledge that there have been profound changes in families. I reflected momentarily on my own experience of growing up in the 1950s, but to look at the way families perform today is to really confront, again, the recognition of profound changes in families. Fewer parents in this day and age have the choice of configuring the family to specialize in child care in one corner of the house and going out to work in the other. And increasingly, work requires and living requires two parents to contribute through remaining engaged and in touch with the workforce. We're in an environment where knowledge economies are being pushed at us daily in the news, if not on our desks and working environment. And the working family is certainly a requirement that has led to the demand for earlier child care and early child education. The consequences of this have been increasingly high expectations for children. And an overemphasis on the instrumental value of child development. We're not quite at the stage of having the infant in arms and going, she's going to be the next bank manager. But there are times when I look at the instrumentality that's given to the value of child development and rather opine about children as beings in addition to what they might become. There are certainly in this beliefs about early childhood enrichment and intervention in the early years agenda, and I'm an advocate of this. I would also like to bring to it in the talk today some encouraging realism about these expectations. And there's been downward pressure, if not hope, for earlier and earlier identification in children in need. And this talk is structured around some of what we're observing in child development. So the questions that I've posed for today are twofold. One is, how realistic are our expectations about the identification of children in need of early childhood enrichment? And what does the growth of their development tell us about how we should view prevention and intervention opportunities? So it's a double-barreled set of questions, and I'm going to unpack them more or less in order through the talk. So we're going to take a deep breath and see if I can make this work. Okay, you're going to be the test of that. What we're going to do in our voyage through this is use language development as an indicator of child development. So the term, I'm going to be using the terms a bit interchangeably here, and I'll come back to the wisdom of that as I conclude. I think there's a legitimacy, certainly, in focusing on language development as part of child development, and I know I'm preaching to the converted here, and it's agreed that it's a central pillar of human development. Once you have it, here we are, you use it for the rest of your life. There are some striking things about it that I think have merit in reminding. First is, the early timed emergence of language development from about 18 months onward. Every parent looks forward and talks about the first words. Most of us are sitting here and probably know the story of our first words. What follows is the prodigious acquisition, in the absence of formal structured inputs, of language. And it is relentlessly progressive in seeking out the adult model and conforming to it. Children look at the adult listen for it and track their way as they get older towards it. Some are more successful in that than others. The other feature about language development, and now I want to pose for a moment that we think of children, infants, all over the world, okay? Just for a moment, that breathtaking moment when we're able to look down and look at all the children in the world. They come into the world endowed with language acquisition mechanisms that are capable of responding to an arbitrary system. They have to be ready to acquire any language, anywhere, spoken by anyone. And it commences somewhere in the 18 to 24-month epoch and proceeds effortlessly. It's a very robust developmental mechanism. It takes enormous biological and environmental forces to prevent language acquisition. Some of these are actually threats to survival to stop it from progressing. The other thing that we see about language development is its plasticity. When things do go wrong with it, and for example it's damaged, say in a head injury, recovery in language is time sensitive. We see better recovery earlier in life than we do later in life. There is an undeniable neurobiological representation of language in the cerebral cortex. You need a brain for it, okay? And there are genetic processes that support its acquisition. We see this in the fine scientific studies, family risk studies for language, speech, and reading, where you can see difficulties in running, as it were, in families occurring across family lines. There are known candidate genes for reading and writing, and the heritability studies of twins, monozygotic and dizygotic twins, very clearly point to an element of genetics within the acquisition process itself. The other thing that needs to be featured here about language development, and starts us getting nearer to what we'll be talking about today, is the issue of what grows. And there are three components of language that we could have in our gaze or study. It's arguable that there are four. Pragmatics, I'm dealing with three of them here today. Sounds or phonemes, grammar or syntax, and semantics or meaning. And each one of these component systems shows slightly different variable growth characteristics. The sound system, or phonemes, is usually pretty much in order by the age of 8. Not necessarily perfect, but if you're studying its growth, you better get in early, and you better have it well studied by the time a child is 8. Grammar, on the other hand, has a wider elbow room. You can see grammar developing from the early stages to about the age of 12, where the adult model of grammar is present. All right, you might not see the subjunctive falling lightly from a 12-year-old's tongue, but broadly speaking, it's pretty much grammar is pretty much in order by that point in time. Semantics, on the other hand, is a different kettle of fish. It offers the opportunity to look at lifelong growth in vocabulary. I can go to my knowledge about my vocabulary and find a time when Google was not in it. So in talking about that, the lifelong growth of the semantic system makes it a very attractive candidate for the study of the growth of language. And vocabulary is a good index of this. So we're going to start now right up front with the voyage towards language emergence around vocabulary. And it's completely relevant to start with the story of when parents have concerns about this. They typically present with a common worry. Why is my 2-year-old not talking yet? I'll be referring to this as late talking. I may refer to it as late language emergence. They're equivalent, certainly, in meaning for what I'll be talking about today. One of the things about late talking and the work that we've done, and this constituted an early paper that Kate and Mabel and I worked upon on Western Australian data. This is 1,700 a random sample of 1,700 West Australian children, was to make the observation that late talking can be well measured by asking parents some questions about their 2-year-old. Does Angela point to pictures? Does Fred carry out simple directions, point to body parts, use personal pronouns? And you can take the 6 items you see here and put them together using item response theory into a very good, and what we were able to demonstrate, a very accurate measure that was able to differentiate late language emergence in 2-year-olds from the group that didn't, that were more on track. What that early work provided in the literature was a prevalence estimate of late language. About 13% of all WA 2-year-olds will have late language emergence. It's about 4,500 under current population estimates. And that these kids are really different. Their mean vocabulary score was 62, and their on-time talking counterpart had a vocabulary 3 times that size. So they're really different in terms of what you actually see in their performance characteristics. We became interested in, well, what predicts late talking? How do we understand that as part of the story of development? And again, the West Australian data were very rich in what they were able to provide us in looking at the birth characteristics of the child. These weren't drawn out of a hat. The kind of science that goes into this is to pull together possible predictors that the literature talks about that make sense to us clinically when we speak to parents that have a concern, or we may have our professional or diagnostic hat on. So we ask, which of the birth characteristics are related to late talking? And of the ones that you see here, being a male, slow fetal growth, and prematurity were all related to late talking. We then asked about the maternal characteristics. Again, at the age of 2, which of the maternal characteristics, and prior to the age of 2, which of the maternal characteristics are related to late talking? And you can see the range. We had a very good range of candidate predictors from and on the mother, and asked which of these predict late talking, and none of them predicted late talking. Now that was a heads up in the literature. We had a fight with the editors, I think, at some point in time, and a bit of a round on this. I might say the paper wound up winning the 2007 American Speech, Language, and Hearing Award for the best scientific contribution in that year. But this was a headline item, and it was being found on a representative population of children, not a selected group of children, but on typical children in the population. Family characteristics, we had a look at that. Were there some of these that predicted late talking? And of the family characteristics, a family history of late talking predicted late talking. And children from larger families, this is with 4 siblings and more, were later talking than children in smaller sized families. We did take a glance. Remember, we're trying to predict to age 2, but we did take a look at age 2 of, well, what else was going on with the child at age 2 aside from late language. And what we were able to observe is that gross motor and fine motor, adaptive function, and personal and social functioning was slower. These are not clinically impaired when you look at them, but there's just this general pattern of slower neurodevelopmental function. So where that took us in our opening gamble on looking at the development of language and thinking about intervention was to the observation, look, the earlier predictors of late language at 2 are almost entirely internal to the child, except for family size. Bigger families, tended to result in a higher odds of late talking. Well, it seemed completely reasonable with the data that we had to at least ask, well, what happened to the late talkers? We've got them there at 2. What happened? And we were fortunate again in Western Australia to be able to follow them until they were 7 years old, when we measured them with a standardized test of general language ability. And this again was published in the following year with, I think, less of a fight, if I remember, around that. And here's the story. Now, in terms of looking at what happened, of the 2-year-olds that started late at 2, 80% of them went on to catch up. Now, the corollary of that is that of the kids at 2 that started behind, 20% stayed behind. Of the group at 2 that started on track, 89% stayed on track. And of the group that started on track, 11% went on to fall behind. So we're standing at 2, everybody, looking at 2-year-olds and trying to crystal ball what happens ahead. This is what it looks like. Naturally, any of us would be interested in being able to really get a grip on those that start behind and stay behind, and those that and being able to look, here's one that started on track but that is going to fall behind. And when we tried to model, to predict those groups, we couldn't do it with any efficiency. So we were stuck in the early language epoch without really being able to drill down on or begin to locate with more precision children that we ought to be or might be interested in terms of intervening and assisting. I'm not going to leave you in despair here. Okay, that won't happen. There was an additional surprise in the findings. Of the children who were now behind in their talking at the age of 7, there were equal proportions of boys and girls. Back at 2, 70% of them were boys. Now, what does this mean? Well, if we select children for language services at the age of 2, most are going to be boys and girls are going to be underserviced. Of the children that are delayed at 2, 80% of them will catch up without intervention. And of the children that are not delayed at 2, about 20% of them are going to fall behind. So when you actually think about, well, what's going on we're interested in development, boys must have accelerated their language growth to close the age 2 gender gap, and the children who started on track must have slowed down. You know, that's basically what the machinery of growth would suggest is happening. So we then really buckled down to go, well, how do we characterize language growth in early childhood? Was it possible to better study the causes of changes in language growth between 4 and 10 years of age, where we would expect to see more stability? And would it help us predict more or guide us more in terms of what we should be able to do? Am I making sense? Worry about it. Okay, so let's have a look. One of the ways that we're able to look at the influences on language growth in young children is through the lens of the longitudinal study of Australian children. As you know, I and my team have had a hand in the development of this study right from its very beginning, back in 2002. For me, that's where most of this white stuff on the side of my head, I think, came from. It's an ongoing biennial collection. 5,000 children followed from birth and another 5,000 who were 4 followed, randomly recruited across Australia. And this has been a very fertile study for Kate and Daniel. Our entire team has been producing findings over the last few years, from about 2013 onwards. And I'm going to summarize what we've been finding and then give you a preview of what we're currently working on. So what are the influences on language growth in young children? Well, a heads up here, because we're going to need to talk about how we measured growth. And it's the only place I'm really going to drill a bit hard on the methodology. Most of this is going to focus on the messages rather than how we got them. You can go and read the method. We've used a measure of receptive vocabulary, the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test. It was given to the longitudinal study of Australian children, the LSAC children as I call them, at ages 4, 6, and 8. The measure is a measure of the semantic component of language development. The measure has a very good item response theory undergirding it and good vertical scaling to allow the measure of growth. Children are prompted, as many of you would be familiar. Here you go, Fred. Here's a picture, show me running. And then as the test proceeds, pictures and the words particularly get more difficult as we go up the scale. You can get an estimate of the growth of vocabulary without having to open up Fred's head and count every word that's in there. When you look at the language growth of the children from 4 to 8, this is what that measure looks like. And there's some satisfying features on it, at least. You can see what you expect to see. Children's vocabularies are increasing from 4 to 6 to 8. But one of the other features that you do see here as well is just how wide the variability is at each point along the line. There's a very big envelope of variability around here as we travel through that. All of you are working with this. It's a reality of what you're working with. The fact that you're still in the game just amazes me. It's terrific. Yeah. Yep, that's right. Yep. Thank you. So we looked at this pattern of results, and statistically, you can ask, well, what influences the growth? So that's our interest. What actually influences the growth of this? And hold your breath here, because the study actually offers you, and this wasn't throw the kitchen sink at it, by the way. When you sit down and read what in the literature has guided our thoughts about language growth and development, they're pretty clear guidelines and beliefs about it. There are certainly things about the child, about the mother, and about the family that are deemed to be important. We were also careful to select things that, as clinicians, as teachers, as researchers, we could actually ask parents about and make sense from. There are 29 candidate predictors of language growth here. When we statistically examined them, 16 of them were related to growth effects. You can either choose to look at the black ones and grieve, or look at the red ones, which are related to growth effects. And when we finished the multivariate modeling of these 16 growth effects, 11 of them remained robust and statistically significant within the multivariate model, and we felt confident, and so did the reviewers, that these were related to the growth that we were seeing in this case, the Peabody Picture vocabulary test. So 11 of these predictors, 16 in general, showing growth effects. So that's kind of the story of what influences language growth. Let's look at the way they influence. Non-English speaking families have a harder time here. Their children, on average, start 16 months behind relative to their English-speaking counterpart, and after 4 years, they're 4 months behind. That's a pretty steady truck in terms of making progress. In terms of low school readiness, and we use the Who Am I instrument, it's a preschool instrument through the ACER that allows us to look at school readiness. Children that had low school readiness were 15 months behind at age 4, and at age 8 they had moved along that line, but we're still 6 months behind. Not being read to, those children at age 4 on average were about a year behind. The children that were being read to and 4 years later rather, were 7 months behind. You have to get the flavor of this just in terms of looking at how does this predictor set relate. The children in larger families, there are other kids speaking for them, I think, start about 10 months behind, and at age 8 remain about 8 months behind. Now, the findings that we've got here are important because we have relatively few population data sets where we can look at growth. You know, they're not out there to select from. So there's a great interest in this. Low family income. I'm not going to completely drill you on all of these. I want to just give you the flavor. We're looking carefully here at 11 predictors. I'll come to a couple of them through here. Low maternal education. This is an important one. These kids start a half a year behind at age 4, and they remain that way. There's no relative growth to children that are in families where the mother is more educated. A particular note that I would make is right at the bottom of children living in circumstances of area socioeconomic disadvantage. At age 4, it doesn't really matter whether you're in an area of socioeconomic disadvantage or not, but by the time you're age 8, you've fallen behind 8 months relative to kids that are living in advantaged areas. And that's something I'm sure we'll discuss as we go. So we have 11 predictors here that are associated with growth in this way. Well, do those 11 predictors efficiently predict language growth? No. They don't do this. I don't want you to get bitter here, so we'll continue to explore this. The predictive utility of that model was very poor, and you can certainly read about that in our third paper. 53% of the variance in vocabulary growth was predicted by age alone. As long as you knew the age, you could predict pretty well, but only 7% of the variance in vocabulary growth was predicted by the other 11 predictors. There's more, all right? There's more. Okay, well, it's completely reasonable to ask, well, why is prediction so poor? What's driving this story? What's happening over time to the position of the child with respect to their vocabulary growth? Let's look now at where children start and where they wind up. Our first look at this allowed us to sort the children at age 4 into the bottom 15%. So we've got the lows, the middle 70%, average, and the high starters. And, gazing at that suggests a bit of comfort from the standpoint of what you see. The high starters gained 8 points. They actually had plenty of room to gain more. The point that I would make here is they didn't rocket off the chart. So starting high doesn't necessarily produce a rocket ship. Okay, the middle starters gained 15 points, and the low starters gained 20 points. And while they gained the most, they finished where the high starters started. Okay? So that's a feature of what we see here. What does it mean? Well, outwardly, there appears to be stable patterns of language growth. The lows stay low, and so forth. The highs are not rockets. It's good, steady slog, right on upward. But the changes in the slopes of the line also suggest that children may be moving around. So we thought, well, let's go back to those scatter diagrams and have a look at what really went on. So here you see now we're going to put our nose right against the data, and over here on the left, we've sorted everybody back into low, middle, and high, and now we're tracking the individual children. Look what happens. Follow the lows, for example. All of a sudden, as you move along, you can begin to see them being distributed throughout the middle and high in later years. So from 4 to 8, if we only target children on the basis of being low, we're going to continue to deliver interventions to many who don't need them and miss others who will. And what about the growth from language into literacy? I better add this piece here because I'm speaking to the faculty of education. I think it's important to add this dimension. By now, the children were 10 years of age, had grown into school. We asked the teacher in the longitudinal study of Australian children to carry out an academic rating scale that has a measure of literacy within it. And so we were able to scale that measure, and this is what we were able to see in terms of the move from our language or vocabulary measures into literacy. The reason we have a plateau here is, yes, there's a ceiling effect in the instrument itself. It's more interested in the lower range than it is going on and on to the top. But again, we can see the movement that occurred from being parked down there at 4 in, at the gate in low, middle, and high, and what happens in the onward progression. Now, just to really give you the sense of what happened here, this is what the random sample of children looked like that was in the LSAC. We had 4 years. We had 318 in the low group with about 2,400 in the middle to high group. 120 of them went on at 6 years to remain low. 198 of them moved over. Oh, and yes, 188 decided to switch camps. Okay, now we looked at them. Back here you've got the 308 at the bottom. Now, what happened to the 308? 112 of them moved on, staying low at 8. All right, this is making sense? And here, just to go back, there's a 332, 2460. What happened to them? 110 moved on. And what did it look like? Place your bets. Okay? Now, all of us are working in this environment, and in a population environment like this. And this isn't designed to undermine what you're doing. We need to keep what we're doing. There's some things I think that this invites us to think about in the way we do things. If we summarize those patterns, there are actually 16 different pattern possibilities. We can have the kids that start and stay on track right throughout that series, the kids that stay low throughout that. And when we looked at that, we had children who were on track. 69% of the LSAC children stayed straight on track throughout. 18% of them demonstrated an improving pattern, 12% of them a declining, and 1% stayed low, 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 low throughout. And our attempts to predict these groups continue to produce poor predictive utility. So, prediction of children with low literacy at age 10 on the basis of low language at younger age was poor. Late rather than early identification is inevitable for children who actually start well and decline. Everything was okay and now it's not, or whatever. This isn't a failure of early intervention or early monitoring. It's a feature of what we see in the growth patterns of children. As Kate observed, if that's all it took to throw a child off, the children just aren't made that badly, okay? It's a pretty robust thing. That doesn't mean that things don't go wrong or can't be improved. But I want to return now to our question, the first of our question. How realistic are our expectations about the identification of children in need of early childhood enrichment? Because there's this great belief that if we can just get the right group together, we can concentrate our resources on them, and we'll have nailed the issue. Well, early identification and targeting of children on the basis of risk is going to miss many children who are on track early and fall behind later.
Steve,
yeah.
Let's ask a question. Often those children, were their parents notified? Did they act on that at any
No. The study is a classic observational study. We're here to look. Yeah. Good question. Good question.
None of them had any therapy.
They're all mixed in there. We'll talk about, we'll talk about the typical speech therapy they got, 10 hours, okay? Early identification and targeting of children on the basis of risk. It's going to include substantial numbers of children who are behind and who go on to catch up. That's going to happen. So the implications of the poor prediction that we're looking at is that policies and services have to fit that. And it suggests to us that services will need to provide multiple touches in terms of developmental opportunities. This is part of my enthusiasm for the early years and part of my enthusiasm for what education's role increasingly looks like in the early epoch. Certainly time-efficient and cost-effective developmental surveillance in the preschool and school years would be desirable. Okay, we're getting near to the end of the talk. Got about 8 or 9 minutes here on the running meter before I turn you loose on me. What does the growth of their development tell us about how we should view prevention and intervention generally? So I'm going to really push hard on language development here, and we'll come back and go, well, you know, how safe is it to do that? This is the focus of our current work. Now, one of the things, you remember the 11 risks, the 16 and the 29, okay? We were studying individual risks. Well, what about any, you know, we picked up the non-English speaking bit. We picked up the low maternal education bit. We picked up the income bit, you know, and looked at it. Well, the truth of the matter is those risks travel in batches. They travel in packs, okay? You're very unlikely to be, as it were, hooked by a low income situation independent of all of the other things. So they don't occur one at a time. The risks that we're looking at define what I'm going to refer to and our group refers to as developmental circumstances. Statisticians have a way of looking at that called a latent class analysis, where we take the risks and we're able to statistically analyze them and group them into classes. Perhaps looking at these circumstances may offer different ways of thinking about interventions to change child development. Well, there are 6 latent classes, or 6 circumstances that these children group themselves into. 46% of children are developmentally enabled. Their vocabulary growth was on time, from 4 to 8, absolutely on time, and very robust. Their mothers were older, more educated, there were smaller families, no multiple stresses in those families. Okay, they were not confronted by a whole chain of life stresses and disasters. There was prevalent book reading, and a very good, nearly half of the non-English speaking population is parked in this group. Now that's a headline indicator for my colleagues in the faculty. There's a good segment of NES, the non-English speaking population, in the developmentally enabled group. Let's look at the 5 other risk circumstances that we're looking at. Now, this is in draft form currently on the table with the team, you know, kind of looking at it. So it's not out there yet, even in publication, much less under review. We've got another piece of the non-English speaking population, about 7% of children who are actually resource poor. When you actually look at the circumstance, there's a high level of mental health distress, low employment and income, area disadvantage, low book reading. They start 26 months behind at the age of 4 their non-English speaking resourced counterpart. Okay? And boy, do they race. Okay? That's a big catch-up. It's a rapid growth. And remember, we could only go that far. You know, if you were drawing the slope straight out, you might wonder, well, how long does that continue for? We've got another group of children that are in families that are quite simply overwhelmed, and all of you will know these families, full stop. They're readily identifiable. Everything that could go wrong has gone wrong. There's very low school readiness in the children, maternal mental health distress, education, unemployment, and in addition to that, low income, health care card and area poverty. The real issue here is they've had the book thrown at them in terms of the risks. They require early, repeated, and sustained developmental support, really delivered differently. This is the group that cannot or will not show up. And That's our responsibility, not theirs. The other group is, now I'm going to sound very old, children with developmental delay. Okay? When you actually look at this, they come from all manner and range of economic circumstances. They can enter the system at any age. They're characterized by low school readiness and generalized developmental delay, highly reactive temperaments with very low stick-to-itness. The mothers tend to report this, yeah, I can see people going, around this. And they require regular developmental monitoring and support services over an extended period of time. The fourth or fifth group out of the six, really, are what we would call battlers. They start 6 months behind and they remain that way. 45% of these families are in the fourth quintile of income. They are larger families. There's low maternal education. And again, area disadvantage is what you see. And again, looking at it from the standpoint of the population, maternal education and training opportunities, finding ways to get parents, really, not just mothers, but parents into education and training are important, and finding creative ways to support the care of their children while they're doing that are pretty critical interventions. And then finally, we've got the group that have low human capital. These are deeply disadvantaged families, and the feature here is they are exclusively in the lowest income quintile, all of them. Okay? And what you see here is starting behind and largely very little growth in the period for over 4 years. The final way of looking at this is to go, well, when we look at the groups that are developmentally abled, the high allostatic load are our overwhelmed families. That was just too fancy. Are our overwhelmed families, developmental delay, and so forth. You can see when the bars are going up, it means that low vocabulary is the odds of it are greater. And we took a look at this particular configuration of the data. One of the things that struck us, certainly across a few of these groups, is that the odds for low vocabulary fall. In other words, things get better on entry to pre-primary and primary school. Now, that might be drawing a long bow in these data at this point in time, but it's an important feature of what we see here. Notice that the battlers, or the working poor, pretty much stay put in terms of their risk of low vocabulary in this particular plot. Okay, I'm going to start to finish. Let me sum up. The first thing that I would say, by way of starting to sum up, is that vocabulary development is not the sum total of language development. We know that. Okay, we've got that. It's very difficult, though, to get good measures of growth, which is what we've had, and it is a study that offers a look at that. But we acknowledge that it's not the sum total of language development. Secondly, language development is not the sum total of child development, okay? Other things do grow. What we do need are better measures of the other things that we think we're interested in. There's an awful lot of talk about emotional regulation, but I can't lay my hands on good growth measures of emotional regulation over time. And the question that I have about the other things that grow is, do they show the same amount of variability that vocabulary does? In other words, are we pushing up against that and having to think our way through of, well, how should we be configuring what we do around that? So what does the growth of their development tell us about how we should view prevention and intervention opportunities? Well, first, children are not rockets. I didn't see rocket ships in those data, okay, from that standpoint. Helping vulnerable children develop faster than their typically developing peers is a huge task. It's a big task, okay? And we're lucky. We're interested in it, okay? It requires changing two aspects of their development. One, where they start relative to typical children. That's called an intercept in mathematical terms. And how rapidly they grow, in other words, the slope, relative to typical children, okay? And these data, good quality growth data, suggest that this is a very big task indeed. Our patterns of instability and unpredictability suggest that the services that we're offering need to provide multiple touches across childhood with lots of points of entry into that. Place-based services for children and families in communities with high socioeconomic disadvantage and high concentrations of risk factors are something that we need. Why? Because it addresses the families that can't or won't engage. We need to hike over the fact that it's our responsibility to handle that reality rather than sitting back and say, well, I'm offering it. If they won't come, too bad. And that has implications for, I think, some of our thinking around school. Policies and services have to fit language and literacy patterns. Under and over-servicing is inevitable. Get over it. You're going to do it, okay? It'll happen. We can't sort that out for you. At the point you're there with a child, you're never going to know if you're under or over-servicing. You're there doing a good job would be the thing that I would say. You're one of the touches that goes on. Late rather than early identification is inevitable for children with a declining pattern. We better be interested in finding them and trying to bump them back on that track. This isn't a failure of early intervention or early monitoring. I want to finish with just a few questions, and then it's done, okay? Services provided by the early childhood sector here in Western Australia, and I suspect in many other places, need to be organized in easy-to-navigate pathways from, say, birth to 5 years, so that the benefits can add up over the course of childhood. Do you think we can better help families with this navigation? I don't know how to do it. I'm not certain I know how to do it, but I think it's a good question. There's a huge amount of activity in the early years here in Western Australia, and a lot to draw upon, and a lot of thinking and thought that's going into it and gone into it. But what is the navigation like through that? Can we produce better data systems that allow us to follow individual children over time and to know how they're doing a little better? And how do we share this information among those who are in positions to make developmental contributions to children and carers? Teachers, for example, people in daycare. You know more about this than most people do. And I'm just in awe of what you're able to do, and the confidence, and hope you've got confidence in being able to pass that on to the next person that might have an opportunity to developmentally touch the child. And can we use this, finally, can we use this kind of framework to better assess the benefits of early childhood policies and services? I think we've got a lot going for us here in Western Australia, and an impressive and highly interested group of people looking at it. Thank you very much. It's such a fine question you're asking, because it sits so closely with the notion of engagement and the kind of proximal opportunities that teachers have and educators have with children. No, we haven't looked at it yet. The encouraging thing, I mean, it's more than a good question. It actually is in the space that we'll be looking at, and that's ahead of us in the work that we're doing. All of that. The other thing that travels in packs is the likelihood of going to a less well-resourced school, for example. Now that becomes a very major story at a policy level and where we're going in our thinking about educational equity. Yes? Other questions? Please.
Did you do anything in the way of connecting language with social skills or empathy with these children, or was it only language?
At the moment, it's just a focus on language growth characteristics. Yes. Yes.
Can I ask about the push down of curriculum into kindergarten and the
Yeah.
impact that has on children with low oral language? So we're requiring children to do more and more formal reading and writing activities before they develop that oral language, and will that impact on their trajectory for growth?
Look, I think I don't have an answer to that question, and it's one of the things that excites me about coming into a faculty where I have the opportunity to mix with specialists in the area that are interested in looking at that and in the nature of what children, as it were, are ready for or not. And again, your question's a good one because it cuts to the heart of, well, is there rocket fuel here, or what's the relationship between what really is going on in the developmental environment and what the child's experiencing and doing? And that certainly is not yet enabled within the work we're doing. It's a fine question, Jenny.
Do you suspect, Steve, that some of the children with low language, when they actually acquired reading skills, that their reading development, you gave them the opportunity to develop their vocabulary?
Oh, that's a good question. Do I suspect?
Yeah.
That's got to be part of the equation.
Yeah, because something's doing that.
Well, again, it doesn't come from their genes. Let's put it that way. It's out there. Yeah.
Some children with low language development can still learn to code.
Of course.
Code, and then move through.
Yeah.
And the reading process.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. Please.
About 60 years ago, Lita Hollingworth, and about 20 years ago, Miraca Gross saw a close relationship between early reading ability and rocket development of language. I'm wondering, therefore, if your study found no rockets at all, or if Gross and Hollingworth were wrong, or if there's something about iron oxide breathing in Western Australia that caused it.
Look, I don't have a ready answer to that. The data here would suggest that there's a general variability that's a reality here. You can see the story of reading to children and again, I've got colleagues who've taught me, and I love the phrase, sharing a book rather than reading from the standpoint of what you're doing with a child at particular ages is also a proxy for other things that you are doing with the child. We load an awful lot onto it's the book that's doing it, okay? And I just don't think that when you look across the globe, I don't think it works like that. It's not that neat. I think book sharing, book reading is a proxy for a lot of other things going on within that boodle, and it's one of the reasons why you'd want to encourage it. I mean, it's again that kind of one of those touches that you'd like to have in terms of the messages that you send. Kate, have I said that? Well, you're just nodding. Okay, good. Okay, yes.
Mine's more a comment than a question. I'm very pleased to hear you talk about developmental variability, because it seems to me that as policymakers we've got stuck on early intervention, and my hobby horse has been early intervention at the point of need. Yeah, and this is the perfect.
Yeah.
For example, the language development centres in the education department came through and stopped at 6 or 7.
Yeah.
And then the education department said, well, we're done with language support.
Yeah.
Early intervention, we
Yeah.
had it.
Yeah.
And it's very frustrating from a point of view of a therapist or whatever.
Yeah.
From that point of view, if you can get that message across, we're halfway there.
Well, we're going to need help. All right. This is an acid test for the message, because if we can't get it across here, it's not going to go anywhere. Okay, from that standpoint.
And the other interesting thing, sorry, was
Well, there's definitely some of that. Whether, again, at the end of the day, it is what it is. Regression to the mean,